As Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Menachos Daf Ayin Aleph 71, and we'll begin from Daf Ayin Samach Testament Beis Liktzer Lifnei Ha'omer. Okay, Liktzer Lifnei Ha'omer. It's by the two dots there. Okay, basically the Mishnah said that there's an additional. We know you're not allowed to eat the Chodesh. You're not allowed to eat the new grain until they bring the Omer. But the Mishnah said that there is an additional restriction of you're not allowed to harvest your grain prior to the Omer. You're not allowed to harvest your 5 grains. You're not allowed to harvest wheat before the bringing of the Omer. Omer Rabbi Yochanan. So how do you know that? The Torah only says don't eat, like Seichlu. Omer Rabbi Yochanan said, Asi Reishis Reishis Mechala. And make a Gzeir Shava, Reishis Reishis Mechala, that Reishis Ktsirchem. It's the first of your shearings. So the first of your shearings has to be made from those 5 types of grains. There it's usher. It's usher to share, usher to harvest any of the 5 types of grains prior to the cutting of the omer. Okay, prior to the cutting of the omer. My koidim la'omer. And then the Mishnah says you're not allowed to eat the new grain. You're not allowed to eat the new grain prior to the Omer. What does that mean? Rabbi Yoina says, Koidim Ketsiris Omer, that you're not allowed to eat the new crop before they cut the Omer. Rabbi Yosi bar Zavda Omar, Koidim Havois Omer. Rabbi Yosi said that it's prior to the bringing of the Omer, not the cutting. The cutting was done Matzah Pesach, the first night. So Rabbi Yosef B'Sav says you can't just eat the new crop then. You have to wait till the bringing of the Omer. And the Gemara is going to come to that conclusion that makes sense. Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, Asurim B'Chodesh, you're not allowed to have the new crop, Lifnei Ha'omer, that's before the Omer. You're not allowed to have Lifnei Ha'omer before the Omer. V'Liktzar Lifnei Pesach, you're not allowed to stop, you have to stop cutting, you're not allowed to cut your wheat, your 5 types of grain before Pesach. That's the Gersa that Rashi has. So basically, there are two shiurim over here. Harvesting, you're not allowed to cut before they cut the Omer, which is at night, the first day of Pesach. You're not allowed to eat the new tvua until after the mincha is brought the next day. So Bishlam Lamandiyama Koidem Avois Omer, that you're not allowed to eat until they bring the Omer. Hainu the like Ka'arav Lahu V'Taralu. That's why the Mishnah says it as 2 different shiurim. One the Mishnah says cutting is usher to Pesach, and eating the Omer is usher. Eating the new crop is usher until they bring the Omer. Prashtus. Ela Lamandiyama Koidem K'Tziras Omer. That means that you're allowed to eat, according to the opinion that says you're allowed to eat from the new crop already, matzah Pesach, at that night, livrainu. So that means they're both the same shear. Livrainu v'lis ninhu. Let the Mishnah put it in one group. Asurim b'chodesh v'likser lifnei Pesach. That you're not allowed to eat the new grain and not allowed to cut the new grain before Pesach, which means before the matzah Pesach. So since the Mishnah didn't do that, so it must be there are 2 zmanim. Let's do the 2 zmanim. The 2 zmanim is that you're not allowed to cut your grain field until Matzah Pesach. Matzah Pesach, even before the bringing of the Omer, you're allowed to cut your grain field. However, eating of the new grains is not permitted until after they bring the Omer. So where is there a machlekes between Rabbi Yoina and Rabbi Yosi? It's listed on the end of the Mishnah. Mishnah says, if a plant took root before the Omer, but let's say it took root in the ground, but nothing grew yet, then the Omer is materit. Then you don't have to wait to the next Omer to eat that whatever grows. But the Omer was mater, even something that was not even just took root in the ground. My koidim la'omer. What does it mean? It has to take root before the Omer. Rabbi Yoina says the rule is koidim avois Omer. It had to have taken root before the bringing of the Omer. Rabbi Yosi bar Zavda Omer koidim ketziras Omer. Rabbi Yosi bar Zavda says no, the time is before. It had to have taken root in the ground before the cutting of the omer, which is matzah Pesach at night. Now the Gemara goes to another thing. Amalei Rab Laza, we go to Ayin Aleph on an Eiv. Amalei Rab Laza Rab Yoshi Didari. Rab Laza said to Rab Yoshia, who lived in his generation, because there are two Rab Yoshias. There was an old Rab Yoshia who was a Tana, who was still living in the generation of the Meroim. But Rab Laza was talking to the Rab Yoshia, his contemporary. And he told him, don't sit down. Explain me the source of this concept that we learned in the Mishnah. The concept that we learned in the Mishnah is that the oimer is matter, the new grain. But not only is the oimer matter, the new grain, it's matter even a plant that just took root, didn't grow yet. The oimer was matter it. So when it eventually grows, let's say like a couple of weeks after Pesach, you're allowed to eat it. So how do you know the zman, the time is when it took root? How do I know that the oimer is matter something that took root? Now let's just, I just want to bring this up because I drew it out over here. I should have made hold on a second. Let me just print it out so we can see it as a rule. Hold on. M73. The oimer is matter. A plant will have many different here. A plant, it takes root, right? You can see it taking root. Then it comes above ground, right? You can see it on the screen. Then it becomes like animal food. It grows a drop. Then it grows a third. So some people could eat it when it grows a third of its growth. And then it grows till it's ripe, okay? So we're saying that the key rule is that if it took root, the oimer is materit. So now we're trying to find where's the source of that. The ksiv, so he answered, Rabbi Yoshia answered the ksiv, the Torah tells you, aviv, that the oimer is you bring the oimer from ripened, the flour, the oimer gift that you give to Hashem is from aviv, from ripened grains. So lav meklal the ikad lav the aviv, the lav aviv. So it comes to include. It must be that the oimer is matter things that are below being fully ripe. So that's what the Gemara is saying. If the Torah is telling you only bring the oimer grains from ripened wheat, from ripened barley, so it must be that the oimer itself is matter things that are a little bit less than the ripened grain. So it must be. So the Gemara says, then I'm going to ask you a question on that. The question I'm going to ask you is. How do you know that maybe true, the oimer is matter plants that are not ripe yet, the lav aviv, but maybe l'oil dal shalish. Maybe in order for the oimer to be matter, it had to have grown a third before you bring the oimer. Shmuel said, mahochel chemesh. When the Torah tells you mahochel chemesh, when it started bringing a third, so then you could bring actually the oimer grains from the hochel chermesh, lav mechlal the ikad the lav bar chermesh. So when the Torah is discussing this, it implies that the oimer would be mater, would permit and be a mater for things that did not bring a third. Okay, so the Gemara says, yeah, but the lav bar chermesh loylim shachas. Maybe the Torah was telling you that the oimer is only mater things that are not yet a third, but they're still animal fodder. Rabbi Yitzchak Kama. The Torah tells you that from standing grain, as soon as it pops out of the ground and is somewhat stiff, then that's what the oimer is mater, and you could start bringing the barley from that. Lav machlal de lav bar kama. Maybe the Torah is implying things that are not yet standing, didn't pop out of the ground. So therefore, the Torah is telling you that the oimer was mater even less than that shear. Says the Gemara, maybe the Torah is only mater things that are not yet stiffened coming out of the ground, but it still came out a little bit from the ground. So basically, the Gemara just went through an exercise, bringing different psukim that seem to say that the Torah is telling you that the oimer is matir things below it. But what we don't find is that if a plant took root in the ground and didn't even pop out of the ground, how do you know the oimer is matir that? And that's what you said in the Mishnah. And what's the source of that? So we don't have the source yet. Elo Amarava, the source is like this: Asha Tizra, that as soon as you plant it, so then the oimer is matir. If you planted it before the oimer is matir. Mishas Zriya, as soon as you plant it. Amalei Rapapa L'Rava, so Rapapa said to Rava, Ihach, if it's just all about planting and putting the seed in the ground, then maybe the oimer is matir even things that did not even take root, because the Torah is only concerned about you just placing a seed in the ground. Amalei, so Rava said, Sudni, he called Rapapa a Talmud Chacham, or a smart businessman. Basodaksiv, the Torah is telling you that it had to have been planted in the ground. That means that it took root in the ground, and that's what the oimer is matir. So it's basically chag b'kotze b'kuri masech asher tizra basodeh, which refers to the oimer, and the Torah is telling you that the oimer was matir anything that was planted but in the ground. It took root in the ground. The oimer was matir it. Okay, new Mishnah. Now we said a rule. The general rule is that you're not allowed to harvest any crop before they bring the oimer. That's not a total rule, because if it's something that you could never bring the barley, we're going to learn from the Mishnah exceptions. Let's call it exceptions. Exceptions to the rule of the Torah tells you don't harvest your field. But sometimes if you're not going to harvest your field before the oimer, you're going to cause it a great loss. You're going to lose the crop. So the Chachamim said you're allowed to do it. If you have a field that's an irrigated field, there's no rain there, and it's in the valley. So if you're going to leave it out in the field after it got ripe, it's going to dry up the entire crop. So they allowed you to harvest. You're not allowed to put it into piles. Okay, so here's your exception. And Chachamim were sensitive to the loss. If you told people you can't cut your field until they bring the oimer, especially in a leap year, let's say, when Pesach is later, you're going to cause a big loss to crops. So Beis HaShalachim, they permitted you to do that. Anshe Yericho, the people of Jericho, Kaitzur B'tzayin Chachamim. Chachamim allowed them to cut their fields. The Goitchim, but they would pile their fields. Shaloi B'tzayin Chachamim. They would put it in already, stack it up into proper piles, and Chachamim didn't like that. But they didn't protest. Sometimes Jewish people do wrong things. Chachamim frown upon it, but they're not going to protest. Then the Mishnah says, okay, you're allowed to cut unripened crop to give for fodder for your animal, because that's not called cutting. Maybe it's not called cutting, or it is. But if it's Rabbi Yehuda Amosai, when is that leniency? You're allowed to cut for your animal food. If you started cutting the crop before a third of it ripened, even if it ripened later on, since you started cutting it right away when a certain growth came out of the ground, that's fine. It's permitted. Rab Shimon says it doesn't matter how much came out of the ground. Since the whole purpose of cutting is for your animal, even if a third grew out of the ground already, so it's somewhat edible, still you're allowed to cut it, because that's not called cutting it if you're cutting it for animal consumption, not human consumption. So the Torah was only answering if you're cutting for human consumption, not if you're going to cut for animal consumption. Animal consumption is not called cutting. That's the opinion of Reb Shimon. Then here's another heter, another leniency. Let's say you have grains that are growing, but right next to, let's say, a fruit tree. or a young fruit tree. So they're somewhat like weeds. They're going to damage the fruit tree if you don't cut it, if you don't harvest that wheat. So you're allowed to cut to protect your young saplings. Also, you're allowed to cut made base for evil, for allowing people to go to do the mitzvah of making the blessing for the avel. They used to make a blessing for the avel in an open area when people would be menachem avel. So if they needed space for that, they were allowed to cut down and harvest. Or bittul beis medrash, you're allowed to harvest your fields if you're going to use it as a place for people could learn Torah. Let's say there's no space and you needed to cut some grains, some of wheat, in order to people to learn Torah. So even if it's before the Omer, you're allowed to cut it, because the Torah only answered only if you're cutting, let's say, for yourself and for a profit. But if you're cutting for a mitzvah, so then you're allowed to cut even before the Omer. Nevertheless, even when the Chachamim say that you're allowed to cut for the Omer, lo yasa oisim kriches, you should not make bundles. You leave them untied. So they allowed you to cut, but don't tie them. Don't tie into bundles. Now we talk about another topic. What is the barley made from? Mitzvah Omer love minakama. It's supposed to be coming from standing crop. Loy matzah, if they couldn't find standing barley, yavi mina amar, and then you can bring from bundled barley. Mitzvah say love min alach. The mitzvah is that it should come from soft and brittle type of barley. Loy matzah, if you can't find that, yavi mina yavesh, you can bring from the dry. Mitzvah say likza balayla. The mitzvah is to cut the barley for the Omer the night before. So right matzah first night Pesach, when we have our second night Seder, they would cut the barley. If they didn't cut it by night, there's also a mitzvah niktzur b'yom. You could cut it during the daylight hours. Kosher, it's kosher. V'doiches Shabbos. Let's say matzah Pesach is Friday night. You're allowed to even start cutting on Shabbos, which is unusual. You're allowed to be cut even on Shabbos. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa. Here's another leniency. Rabbi Binyamin said, one pasuk says that you could harvest your fields and bring the Omer. So it's mashma from this pasuk. You could that harvesting of the fields happened even before the cutting of the Omer. Ksiv, and one pasuk says, okay, ksiv reishus ktsirchem ela kohen. Your first cuttings should be to the kohen. So it's mashma from that pasuk that you're not allowed to cut your fields before the cutting of the Omer. So which is it? Okay, how do you resolve that? So the answer is like this: if it's a normal field, then you're not allowed to cut before the cutting of the Omer. Maybe if it's a type of field that you couldn't bring the Omer flour from, it's a bad barley field, or let's say it's an irrigated field. So you're permitted to cut your field. So it's only the Torah is strict, and therefore, if you want to know another reason why kaitrim beis hashalachim, besides the loss if you don't harvest it, beis hashalachim was an irrigated field. The crop there is not as high quality, and therefore there was no isser in the Torah to cut from such a field. Says the Gemara, how do you know that's what the Torah means? Maybe the Torah means something else. Ema, let us say, maybe the Torah is telling you something else different. Maybe the Torah is telling you that you're not allowed to cut a barley, but if it's a field made of wheat, you're allowed to cut because you're not using wheat for your Omer. It's only barley. So the Gemara says, "Ahu loy matzos amrit mid Rabbi Yochanan." Rabbi Yochanan already brought a gzeira shava that the isser to cut and harvest applies to 5 types of grains, even from the grains that you're not going to bring the Omer from. So when the Torah says that in a certain field you're allowed to cut prior to the Omer cutting, it must be referring to something else, that a type of field that's producing very bad crop, and therefore you were not going to bring the Omer from that field anyway. It couldn't qualify for the Omer. That field was permitted to cut even before the cutting of the Omer. Says the Gemara, Anshe Yericha Kaitzrim B'Tzayin Chachamim. The Anshe Yericha would cut before the cut their fields, and the Chachamim agreed. Maybe the Eureka people were going to sustain a loss if they didn't cut. The Goichin Shaloi B'Shayin Chachamim, and they would pile, and Chachamim didn't agree when they're piling it and setting it up. So Man Shamet Leidama Micha V'Loi Micha, Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara assumes that the author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. And what the Gemara is now going to bring, the author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says sometimes Chachamim protest and sometimes Chachamim don't protest. We'll see that later. But the point is that our Mishnah says that to cut, if there's going to be a loss, Chachamim are okay with it. Says the Gemara of Asava Rabbi Yehuda, consider the Anshe Yericho B'Tzayin Chachamim Havai. Does Rabbi Yehuda hold that Yericho people Chachamim were okay with them cutting? But Tanya, we learned in the Braysa, Shisha Devarim also Anshe Yericho. 6 things that Anshe Yericho did. Shloisha B'Tzayin Chachamim. 3 the Chachamim were okay with. Ushloisha Shloi B'Tzayin Chachamim. And 3 Chachamim were not okay with. The Elusha B'Tzayin Chachamim. And the following things with the Chachamim were okay with it. Markivim, the Kolis, Kolayim, the Karchanesh Shema, the different lists. The Koitzim Lifnei Haimer B'Tzayin Chachamim. The third thing is they were allowed. Chachamim said they're allowed to cut their fields. Okay, the Elu Shaloi B'Tzayin Chachamim, Goichin Lifnei Haimer. Chachamim did not allow you to pile. If they allowed you to cut, but if they don't allow you to make it into nice piles, parts and parts begin the same part. The point is, Rameir holds that Birtzayin Chachamim is to cut, and Shloi Birtzayin Chachamim is to pile, which is similar to our Mishnah. Amalei Rabbi Yehuda said, if Chachamim allowed you to cut, if Chachamim allowed you to do these things, everybody's going to want to do these things. Ela elu ve'elu shaloi b'tzayin Chachamim. The Chachamim did not allow you to do these things, but sometimes they protested if you did it, and sometimes they didn't. So, but either way, they didn't allow you to do it. The following things they did not protest, even though they didn't want you to do it. Markiven, the kolam, akolyayim, the karchim, as a shma. Basically, Markiven, the kolam, kolyayim is referring to working on Erev Pesach, to doing something like that. The karchim is shma, the koitzim, the goitzim lifnei oimer, and the chachamim did not allow you, they didn't like you when you cut before the oimer, but and pile before the oimer, but they didn't protest if you did. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda already says that it's shloi b'tzayin chachamim to cut before the oimer. We go to Amid Beis, Matirin gam ziyos shel hegdish shel charav shel shikma parts and parts began the same part the same the lahachan shal lani b'shnei b'tzayos b'shabos u'yam toimim v'noisnim peil yerek umichu b'yadam. The following things that the Anshe Yericho did, a bunch of lists, and chachamim protested. But the bottom line is, since the author of our Mishnah was Rabbi Yehuda, in this brisa, Rabbi Yehuda says that everything is shloi b'tzayin chachamim, even to cut before the oimer. But the difference is, cutting and goichin, chachamim did not protest. If you did not protest, even though they didn't want you to do that. But our Mishnah says cutting was even permitted. Chachamim said it's okay. So how do you rectify our brisa with our Mishnah if they're the same author? Answers the Gemara, Shisha, are you telling me that according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's 6 things that were done? Some shloi b'tzayin chacham, shloi michu b'yadam, some 3 that they didn't protest. If you count it, Shiva have it. The Bryce itself has a mistake in it. It says 6, and then it lists 7. Alasami mikan katsira. So you have to erase katsira. In other words, you erase from Rabbi Yehuda's words katsira. Katsira, cutting. If there's going to be a big loss if you don't cut, Chachamim have no problem with you cutting. It's not a problem. The only thing is, if they give you the permission to cut before the Omer, they're not giving you permission to make nice piles before the Omer. And if you do that, that's not the Chachamim's Ratzain. However, that's what Rabbi Yehuda is saying, that they didn't protest if you did it. Sometimes if you go against Ratzain Chachamim, they protest because worse could come from your not following the Chachamim. So that we resolve it. Ketzira is a mistake in the Brisa, and Ketzira, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, is permitted before the Omer, if it's going to cause you a loss. Tanan Hashem. Okay, we're going to learn just another 2 minutes, and then we'll stop. So we're going to just learn the Mishnah. Tanan Hashem, we learned in the Mishnah. The Elu mafsik in the Peah. Peah, as you know, it has to be given in the corner of the fields, right? The corner of a field. So, but the question is, what is every field? How do you define a field? So the Mishnah lists you a bunch of things that can separate a field, whereby you're going to have to give a corner in each part of the field. The following divide a field when it comes to regarding peah. Hanachal, bashlilis, v'derech yochid, v'derech rabim, shvila rabim, shvila yochid, hakavua b'moisach cham, b'moisach b'shamim. Basically, if you take a look at the picture, that I'm showing you, you have a field, right? And there's a water walking through it. So now it's counted as two fields, or derech yochid, or let's say a private road, or derech rabim, or a public road walking between you two fields. So then they're counted as two fields, and you'll have to give payah from each field. Or if you have just a path for people to go through that's used in the summer and the winter months, anything like that, you have to give off payah from both sides. Let's say you have a bore. You have a part of your field that's right in the center that's not planted. It's just empty space. That divides your field into two fields, as you can see in the picture. Says the Mishnah is going to say that, let's say you plant a different produce. Let's say you're planting wheat, and then you plant potatoes in the middle, and then wheat again. So the potatoes divide your field into two. That's what the Mishnah says. Then the Mishnah says something interesting. If you start cutting your field, but you're cutting it for animals, mafsik, then it interrupts your field. That means if that's not called cutting it. So if you cut it just to feed your animals, basically you divided your field into two parts, and you'll have to give payah from each side. Divrei Rab Meir. But Chachamim says Eina mafsik. That's not called a cutting, and therefore it's not dividing your field. It's just like as if you started cutting. So according to Rab Meir, cutting for your animal is not considered cutting. Chachamim says that what's considered dividing your field, Elam came charish. If you plow your field right in the middle, then you divide your field. If you start cutting just to give to your animal, that doesn't divide a field into two parts. And we'll stop over here. Rab Meir, Beshitis Rab Shimon Amra. Rab Meir holds like Rab Shimon of our Mishnah. The Amar, Rab Shimon of our Mishnah says that you're allowed to cut your field. You're allowed to cut your field if you're giving your animal, if it's before the Omer. The Amar Yikza B'Yachal Afma Shaviyash Lish. You're allowed to cut your wheat, even if it grew a third, if you're going to give it to your animals. Alma Kasavar. So Rab Shimon holds Kol L'Shachas Lav Ketzirihi, and we'll stop here. That anytime you're cutting for animal fodder, that's not called cutting. And if Rab Meir says that in the Mishnah, that cutting for your animal is not considered cutting, and therefore it's like as if there's a blank space. It's not like you started cutting your field, so it's not one field. Rab Meir is aligning himself with the opinion of Rab Shimon, and that's where we'll end off over here. That the Rab Meir is aligning himself with the opinion of Rab Shimon of our Mishnah. Okay, we'll stop right here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Have a good night.
Good night. Good night.